Good day. Today is the third day since the start of what appears to be the intensified Russian missile strikes upon Ukraine. And I think, at this point, revise my assessment from the video yesterday. I said yesterday that it seemed to me that there was a certain slackening of the Russian missile offensive after the first day. I think that was probably wrong. I think the missile offensive was probably at the same level, except that Ukraine seems to be trying to tighten up information about targets which were hit, which makes it seem, or made it seem yesterday, that there'd been a reduction in missile strikes when perhaps there hadn't been. And that, of course, begs a number of interesting questions about how long this missile offensive is due to continue for. And various people have had quite a lot of fun pointing out, including myself, by the way, pointing out that in the past, where various Western commentators and Western intelligence agencies and Ukrainian agencies had suggested that Russia was about to run out of missiles, and it seems that they have not done so. Well, obviously they have not done so, but instead they're carrying out what appears to be a sustained missile offensive instead. Now, there was an interesting report which was apparently produced by a US think tank or group of think tanks. I haven't read the report myself, but apparently it posits the possibility that Russia could continue to launch missiles at a rate of 100 a day, roughly the level that we're seeing at the moment, and go on doing so for 6 months, and that doesn't even take into account the possibility of more missiles being added to the stockpile from current production. So if this report, if this analysis is correct, it doesn't seem as if the Russians are going to run out of missiles anytime soon. Now, I remain of the view that this isn't yet the really big campaign. That's probably going to come in a couple of weeks' time, and that this is at the moment aimed more at degrading the Ukrainian power system, and as John Helmer, Dancing with Bears, suggested, establishing its points of weakness for the big strikes which are to come. But one way or the other, it is apparently having an effect on the functioning of the power system. It hasn't broken down. There's still electricity in Ukraine. Electricity is being provided to most of the big cities. So we're not talking about a total blackout across the country persisting for days upon days. But apparently, Ukraine is being forced increasingly to move electricity around through the system, and the total volume, I don't know whether we could talk about volume, but the total amount of electricity that is running around the system, going through the system, is gradually falling. Or I should say not gradually falling, but falling faster than had been the case before. So it does look as if already the system is starting to creak and break down, and that problems are starting to accumulate. And one of the interesting things, by the way, is that this missile offensive, especially perhaps in the context of the Crimean bridge attack, which we'll talk about soon, but which did increase Russian popular anger about Ukraine. Well, this missile offensive has brought all kinds of civilian experts in Russia out, and one now starts to see them making comments and suggestions about how it can be made more effective. And one suggestion, which I did find quite interesting, was from a railway engineer who suggested that the single most effective way of knocking out or rather doing serious damage to the to the Ukrainian railway system, the system which Ukraine uses to transport troops from one front to the other, to move equipment from one front to the other, and perhaps most important of all, to bring equipment in from the West, that the most effective way of degrading the system is not to go after the railway tracks, obviously, or even attack the railway stations, but to go for the depots where the locomotives are repaired and maintained, and also to strike at the places along the Western railway, in the Western junctions where trains pass from Poland into Ukraine, and they have to be adjusted for the differences in gauge. Now, this person did make the point that if a sufficiently large number of locomotives are destroyed, Ukrainian locomotives apparently all date from the Soviet era. They are built, designed for Russian gauge, which is different from European, and it would be impossible for Europe or the West to replace quickly Ukrainian locomotives with Western ones because the gauge is wrong. Well, that's one railway engineer. I don't know how practical that is, but you can see that all sorts of people are now chiming in and bringing their proposals forward. And whilst this missile offensive has been underway, there's been another development further south, which is that various commentators, including many Russian commentators, have noticed that water levels on the Dnieper River, this huge river that bisects Ukraine, that water levels are rising. And there were some rumors and speculations yesterday, over the course of yesterday, that the reason for the rise in water levels was because, allegedly, Ukraine was transferring water from the Kiev reservoir into the Dnieper with the specific intention of raising water levels in order to somehow presumably submerge or damage the Novaya Kakhovka dam in ways that would supposedly facilitate the Kherson offensive, Ukraine's Kherson offensive. I have to say, that doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. I'm not quite sure how all that works, and I'd be surprised if a structure like the Novaya Kakhovka dam is as vulnerable to the rise of water levels as some people have been suggesting. But anyway, it seems that that speculation was wrong, because what apparently is actually happening is that as Ukrainian power stations are being damaged, Ukraine is having to rely increasingly on its hydroelectric plants in order to maintain electricity levels. And that means that more water is having to pass through the dams that are holding back the Kiev reservoir. And that it is that which is causing water levels in the Dnieper to rise. In other words, the rise in the water levels of the Dnieper are a byproduct of Russia's missile offensive. Well, that's, I think, all we can say about this missile offensive for the moment. I've been reading more accounts this morning of more Russian missile strikes. I'm not able to gauge, to work out myself how extensive these are. They do seem very extensive. Whether they are on the same level as on the previous days is not something I'm able to say from London. But perhaps more interesting has been a whole series of reports which have been pouring in from the FSB, Russia's counterintelligence agency, and the Russian officials about how the bomb attack on the Crimean Bridge was carried out. And the Russians have now named a whole series of people who were involved, and they pointed out that what a complex operation it was, and that it seems to have involved people from Russia, Russian citizens, Ukrainian citizens, Georgians, Armenians. It was a very complex operation with the truck moved around from one place to another to make searches less possible, the explosive concealed in the truck rather effectively, and the Russians have said that they're gradually rounding up some of the people, at least, who were involved, and that the entire operation was organized by the SBU, Ukraine's intelligence agency, and that it was coordinated and ordered by the head of that intelligence agency. The most interesting thing that one gleans from reading all these reports is that apparently the SBU had quite a sophisticated operation in Russia, tracking the movements of the truck, keeping an eye on where it was going, and presumably there would have been some way to detonate it remotely when it reached the bridge, on the assumption that the driver was not a suicide bomber, which appears to be the current theory. So this is a sophisticated operation, and I have to say, it again suggests that the Russian security system on their own territory is far from watertight. Where it is an enormous country, the ability to keep track of everything, every truck that's moving, I mean, that would probably stretch even the most thorough and professional and all-encompassing intelligence and security agency. But the fact that such a complex operation was carried out on Russian territory, that all of these people were able to move around and keep an eye on what the truck was doing and observe it and presumably send reports to Kiev, I would have thought that does point to security lapses, and no doubt there will be people in Moscow who will be worried about it. Whilst I'm on this subject of security lapses and potential attacks in Russia itself, it's worth pointing out that Putin has already spoken about attempts by Ukraine's special services to create accidents at the Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia, and that there are reports circulating today, the details of which at the moment are very sketchy and which may be untrue, that some Ukrainian operatives or pro-Ukrainian operatives were attempting to bring surface-to-air handheld man-pans missiles into the Moscow region, presumably with the intention of causing some kind of an attack there. So altogether, this is the narrative that the Russians are now giving us of Ukraine increasingly engaging in sabotage and what the Russians would call terrorist attacks, what Western powers, if it were done to themselves, would also call terrorist attacks, as the Ukrainians look for ways to respond to Russia's special military operation, which is, by the way, to my surprise, what this operation is still being called. Now, on the topic of that special military operation, at the moment, as I said, the situation on the battlefields appears to be relatively calm, but I think it might be worth pointing out that for the moment, as of now, as of Wednesday morning, in other words, Wednesday morning in London, and for the last 2 days, such advances as there have been across the battlefronts have again been carried out by the Russians. I said that there was a Russian counterattack towards Krasny Liman, which has now recaptured a string of villages and brought Russian forces or pro-Russian forces once again, apparently within striking distance of Liman. I said previously, I don't think the plan yet is to attack Liman itself, but anyway, they seem to be advancing there. And of course, we've been getting more reports now that the situation, the Ukrainian situation in Bakhmut, is becoming increasingly perilous. Ukraine still has large forces in Bakhmut. They're still resisting. There are reports that they are removing civilian officials from Bakhmut. But if there's been any discussion about pulling out of Bakhmut, that so far has been countermanded. But it does seem as if the ring around Bakhmut is now tightening, and that Bakhmut is effectively now surrounded, at least from three sides, with this ring around the city steadily closing. And there have also been reports, very sketchy reports, very difficult to make much sense of, at least by a non-military person like me, of more advances by the Donetsk militia in the fighting around Donetsk city, and also of Russian forces near the town of Ugleda in southern Donetsk. So, at the moment, such advances as there have been from the Russian side. It's some days now since we've heard of any further Ukrainian advances, either in Kherson region or in northern Donbass and Kharkiv region, or indeed in and around Zaporozhye. Now, that may mean that the Ukrainian offensive has run its course. Perhaps they still have, as I said, some remaining trick they can pull off. But for the moment, at least for several days now, the Ukrainian offensive at least seems to be at a stop. And in fact, in one or two places, in Liman specifically, in the Liman area, it appears to be going backwards. Though, as I said, I would not, for the moment, personally, put too much weight on that. So, where are we in other things? Well, the leader of the UAE is currently has been in Moscow, where he's had a very friendly meeting with President Putin. The UAE is, of course, a major participant in OPEC+. It supported the recent oil production cut. The Biden administration remains furious with Saudi Arabia. It's cutting off contacts. There was supposed to be a Saudi-US meeting. Apparently that's been cancelled. There have been all sorts of wild threats of actions by the United States against the Saudis, things which, to be honest, I think are most ill-advised, but there we go. There's also reports now that the price of natural gas in the United States is rising because so much of it has been exported to Europe. And my own view remains that this export of LNG to Europe from the United States has probably reached its limit and will soon start to fall, in which case there will be more problems in Europe, which I'm going to come to at the moment. There's a meeting apparently in Washington of the IMF, an annual meeting, and I gather, I read a report in the Daily Telegraph from the journalist Jeremy Warner, that the mood there is becoming increasingly grim, that there's a sense in Europe that things are going very badly wrong, and we're starting to see the first signs of recrimination between the Europeans and the Americans. Europeans have finally grasped that there is an imbalance, if you like, in the levels of suffering that the sanctions war has created. United States obviously has its economic problems. Inflation there is high, but there isn't this sense of economic crisis that there is in Europe. And there's been some murmurings and mumblings about the fact that the Americans are taking advantage, and they seem to, and that they allegedly are benefiting from this crisis at Europe's expense. French officials have been talking about that. Even Josep Borrell, the EU's, in my opinion, grossly incompetent High Representative for Foreign Affairs, has made a speech in which, well, not a speech, he's written a piece in which he essentially says that. I have to say that for the Europeans to blame the Americans for problems which the Europeans decided on themselves does seem to me a bit rich. I accept that they've been urged very strongly to do all of this by the Biden administration. But ultimately, it was Europe, the EU itself, that decided to embrace the sanctions war to the extent that it did. European leaders took all of these various steps. It should have been obvious from the outset that this was going to have a massive impact on Europe. For them to blame their own bad decisions on the Americans when it was their own folly that caused them to follow where America had led, well, that all seems to me, as I said, a piece of very strange special pleading. But I do wonder whether all these recriminations will gradually intensify. Anyway, there's been a very interesting piece from Josep Borrell in which he said that he's confirmed what I've discussed previously, that European prosperity was based on cheap energy from Russia, cheap goods from China, and that the situation now appears to be shaping out that Europe is going to lose access before long to both. It's not going to have either the cheap goods from China or, by the way, the possibilities of export to China, and that the energy from Russia, the flows of cheap, reliable, steady energy from Russia, extending all the way back to the 1960s, by the way, that's ending as well. And then the extraordinary thing about Borrell's comments, no awareness of any role on the part of Europe, the EU leadership, the European leaders, himself, that this has been brought about. He doesn't seem to understand at all that these actions, which are leading to the end of European prosperity, which he so laments, are the product of his own decisions and of decisions like him. He's made another comment, which is really, to my opinion, even more bizarre. He says that he appears to acknowledge, interesting that he's done this, he appears to acknowledge that previous promises made to Russia by the Western powers that NATO would not be expanded eastwards were broken. But he says that this doesn't justify the Russian aggression, as he calls it, against Ukraine. He complains that even some of his friends are telling him that this was the explanation for what has happened. And I can only presume that when he means his friends, he means foreign ministers from the global south. Well, let's put aside the question of justification. Justification always involves some element of moral decision. And to be honest, I don't think the Western powers are in any position to make moral judgments on anybody, given their own past conduct over the last 30 years, and perhaps even before then. Let's just talk about Ukraine and about Western policy towards Ukraine and EU policy towards Ukraine. And surely, if Borrell and people like him are now coming to understand how important Russia specifically was for European prosperity, then that must lead logically to the next conclusion, which is that this was an extremely important relationship and that it was in an overriding interest for Europe to safeguard it. Now, that doesn't mean accepting anything and everything that Russia does or agreeing with the Russians on every matter. But it does mean, or it should have meant, being careful not to cross what would have been clearly signaled, what were clearly signaled as Russian red lines. And on the topic of Ukraine specifically, it means treading in Ukraine, if you're European, if you're a Westerner, very carefully indeed. It means not giving up promises that Ukraine would become a member of NATO one day, which NATO did back in 2008, and NATO, of course, includes all the leading countries of the EU. It means not pushing Ukraine into an all-or-nothing association agreement with the EU, as happened in 2013, disregarding Russian economic interests in Ukraine, ignoring the trading relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and flying into a massive sulk when the Russians objected and when the Ukrainians said that the association agreement would have to be renegotiated, and then simply refusing to renegotiate it. It also means not supporting an extra constitutional and unconstitutional seizure of power by a particular faction in Ukraine in February 2014, especially when that faction includes people who are viscerally hostile to Russia and who are viscerally antagonistic to Russian-speaking speakers in eastern Ukraine and want to impose the Ukrainian language on them. And it means not supporting a Ukrainian military campaign against eastern Ukraine in 2014, when the options for negotiation existed and there were proposals made by the Russians and supported by the leaders of eastern Ukraine at that time for decentralization and a federal structure to be created in circumstances that might have avoided a war. And it also means, when that war nonetheless happened, taking steps to ensure that the outline agreement, which provided the pathway to peace in Ukraine, the Minsk agreement, agreed with the Russians, but also by Ukraine itself, was properly implemented. The EU did none of those things. On the contrary, it has ignored entirely Russian concerns about Ukraine, Russian sensitivities about Ukraine, sensitivities which the Russians have been signaling and talking about for years. Not just years, but decades. Now, when this point is made, whenever these points are made, people like Borrell come back and they say, well, you know, it's not what the Russians want or worry about that matters. It should be only what Ukrainians want. That's the only thing that matters. And of course, by that, when they mean Ukrainians, let's be very clear about it, they mean pro-EU Western Ukrainians, they don't seem to acknowledge the existence of pro-Russian Eastern Ukrainians, who they seem to see only as a proxy for Russians. Well, you're going to take that approach if you are going to pursue that kind of policy. Then don't be surprised if your relations with Russia go smash. And don't place all the responsibility on the Russians. Start to accept and acknowledge that this has been created to a great extent, I would say to an overwhelming extent, by your own mistaken decisions. And of course, given how important that relationship with Russia was for your prosperity, ask yourself the question whether you have done right, whether in fact you haven't sacrificed the prosperity of the people of Europe on some sort of quixotic quest in Ukraine, which was bound to raise Russian hackles and create that crisis and that breakdown in that relationship between Europe and Russia, the EU and Russia, which people like Borrell now grudgingly acknowledge was so important. When I say all of this, it seems to me blindingly obvious that this was the case. But of course, Borrell refuses to see that. According to him, Europe always acts with the best interests of everybody in mind, with the best intentions. It's always the other side, the Russians principally at the moment. But also, even Borrell is now talking about the over-dependence of Europe on the US. But just as the collapse in relations with Russia is the product of EU decision-making and EU policies, who ultimately is responsible for the breakdown, for this over-dependence on the US, which Borrell and so many other people in Europe is now complaining about. I have to say, European leaders are not behaving, or so it seems to me, like statesmen and stateswomen, people who lead great nations, nations that have made huge contributions to the world, not always good contributions, it must be said, but certainly important ones. They behave like spoiled children who assume that they're entitled to whatever they want. They have this massive sense of entitlement, and they go into a huge sulk when things turn out otherwise. Well, I hope these spoiled children will at some point grow up and understand that this situation in Ukraine is not going at all as they anticipated. In December, the EU stops importing Russian oil. No obvious substitute for it there on the horizon. Even if the OPEC Plus people were to reverse their production cut, which they show no sign of intending to do, well, there would still be shortages of oil because, as EU leaders have been repeatedly told, there simply isn't enough oil around in the global supply system to replace Russia. Now, the G7 had a virtual meeting yesterday to respond to the Russian missile attacks, and they published a statement, a lot of windy rhetoric, again, as I said, oblivious to the extent to which the West is responsible for much of this problem. It made some really extraordinary comments, by the way, about the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, which again appeared to blame the Russians for the problems at the power station, even though it is the Ukrainians who've been shelling it. But never mind. But the G7, the one thing it failed to do in this statement was say anything at all about the oil price cap idea on Russian oil that's been so much talked about. Now, some people think that this suggests that there's still disagreements about this. I would like to think so. If they do go ahead with this oil price cap idea, then the general shortage of oil in Europe, coming on top of the shortage of gas in Europe, is only going to get worse. But maybe, just now, some doubts are starting to set in. I'd like to think so. Time window is becoming increasingly short. And I say this now many times. We're close to winter, despite some claims that I've seen about temperatures this October being higher in Europe, at least in London at the moment. I'd say that they're lower in Britain than they probably were this time last year. That's my own guess. But anyway, one way or the other, things don't look particularly good economically. I think they're going to look a lot worse militarily in Ukraine before very long. I've talked about how the Ukrainian offensive seems at the moment to be at a stop, and it's the Russians who are making the advances. We're getting this sense that huge forces are gathering and are preparing to launch some great Russian advance. I understand that the director of Belarus's intelligence agency says that if the Russians complete their mobilization successfully, then they will soon have overwhelming forces at their disposal, and that this could all be over by February. Scott Ritter, one of the most astute commentators about the war, and obviously a person with a military background, which is more than I have, thinks the same, that the Russians are now coming close to the point where they can deliver a knockout. If that's true, if the window is February, I'm not saying it is, I'm not able to give those kind of timelines, then I wonder whether people like Borrell and company realize that. If what people like the director of Belarus's intelligence agency says, what Scott Ritter is saying, if all of these claims are true, then by midwinter, there may not be much left in Ukraine to negotiate about. Because I'm going to say this, if the Russians do win a knockout military victory in Ukraine over the next couple of weeks, if the Ukrainian economy implodes, which I have to say is looking to me increasingly likely, if the power structure that is clinging on in Kiev collapses, I'm not sure that the Russians will be in a mood to talk about Ukraine anymore. I've mentioned this in the past. Ukrainian offensive in this autumn seems to open up possibilities for negotiations, but it seems to me that it's now clear, or beginning to become clear, that that offensive, if it has indeed run its course, has been a strategic failure, and that time, not just for Ukraine, but first and foremost, for the leaders of Europe, is starting to run out. Now, perhaps they might also want to consider something else, and that's what's happening in Britain. there's been an extraordinary sequence of events over the last few hours. Yesterday, the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, gave the impression that on Friday, he didn't give the impression, he actually said that on Friday, the Bank of England will indeed stop buying government bonds. In other words, that the resumption of QE is going to stop on Friday. And that immediately caused sterling, British currency, to lose value against the dollar. And it caused problems once more in the gilts market, the market for government bonds. It rattled pension funds, British pension funds, which are very vulnerable to problems in the gilts market. Now, why did the governor of the Bank of England do that? I'm going to make a guess. I think that he's trying to force the British government to change course. He's telling the British government, look, we're not going to go on bailing you out by continuing with QE. Your mini budget has been a disaster. You've got to change direction. You've got to accept that either taxes must increase or the public spending must be severely cut, because we're not prepared to help you continue with your present course any longer. Now, if the Truss Quarteng government does either of those things, if it cuts spending in the way that the Bank of England perhaps wants it to, or of course if it raises taxes, especially if it does the second, then I think it's holed under the waterline. Indeed, I'm going to go further and say that I wonder whether the governor of the Bank of England might be thinking at the back of his mind, in some unacknowledged place, that what he actually wants is not so much to see the government change course, U-turn as we say in Britain, but rather that he wants the Truss Quarteng government to fall, to be replaced by presumably some other leadership, political leadership, either from the Conservative Party or via a new election. So that, of course, would be a high-risk thing for the governor of the Bank of England to do. But the economic situation, the general economic situation, which derives ultimately from the geopolitical situation, makes that sort of thing now possible. European leaders need to consider that what the Bank of England appears to be doing to Truss, Quarteng and the other members of the British government could potentially one day be done to them. I say that there's been something of a pushback against the Bank of England in London this morning. It seems to be floating the possibility that it might continue its bond buying, its QE, after all. But anyway, the very fact that the governor of the Bank of England talked in the way that he did, came out saying the kind of things that he did, that does seem to me to be a significant warning, a sign perhaps of things to come. So I hope both in London and in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris and in other places, people start to heed this. I have to say, I don't think that the spoiled children, the people who run the affairs of Europe, have that ability to do that. But anyway, we will see what they will do, and we will see how things turn out. Well, that's me for today. No doubt we'll be getting more information soon. We'll see whether or not Ukraine does have any more tricks up its sleeve I'm starting to doubt that, but let's see what they might be able to pull off, if they do pull off anything. And of course, we'll see what the Russians are working towards. It's quite clear to me now that they are indeed working towards some sort of a plan. And of course, we'll also see what happens in Europe over the next few weeks and months, and also globally. So much obviously to keep us busy, but that's me for the day. Remember, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Telegram, and of course now Rofkin. Remember also, you can join me on Locals, exclusively on Locals, for live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can come to our shop and buy the great things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all the rest that you will find there. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.